Tiswas and Swap Shop broke through and turned Saturday mornings into immutable slots for epic, live children's shows. And then they went and died within a week of each other. And both the BBC and the ITV network had the unenviable job of replacing the original, founding, definitive examples of their genre. How on earth do you manage that?
Starting soon on ITV at the weekends, new and popular programmes. There's action, adventure, comedy and drama, plus an important new documentary series. Weekends in summer on ITV.
Of course, neither Tiswas nor Swap Shop ran year round. The effort would have killed everyone involved, especially in the former case. No, they ran during what we might call term time, September or October through to April or May or something. The remaining months were initially left effectively empty, plugged with the usual cartoons and half-assed matinees. But as the idea of the Sat AM slot solidified, it became clear that this would not do, and the first summer replacements were born. The balkanised nature of the ITV network meant there were several of these running simultaneously under the auspices of many different regional companies.
Yes, a fine summer on ITV.
The first of these of any note was ITV's Mersey Pirate, a rare excursion into Sat AM territory by Granada. This show, again there's almost nothing of it in the archives, so bear with, ran for a single summer in 1979 on most of the ITV network, Anglia and Times's past. It was set and filmed on a decommissioned old ferry, basically the very same one that Jerry Marsden was singing about. The disco version of that song even served as a theme tune. Your cast were largely on remand from Granada's increasingly old-fashioned working men's club simulator, The Comedians, and included Grant Carson, also known to show up on Tiswas, and at the head, with the title of captain even, boxer-faced pro-am galoot with ladies' hair, Dougie Brown. As if that real ale and tobacco-stained lineup weren't odd enough, they were joined by two characters from a BBC play for today by Alan Bleasdale. Andrew Schofield and Ray Kingsley reprised their roles as Scouse Stairaways Scully and Mooey from Scully's New Year's Eve, a play for today 18 months earlier. Their scenes were even written by the then up-and-coming Bleasdale, which was actually quite jarring alongside the wheel tappers and shunters material from Above Decks. I say Above Decks because Dougie really was the captain, with Wrigley as ship's cook, the hilariously named Monsieur Pierre Le Oui, Carson as quartermaster or some damn thing, and Paul Clayton as the chief petty officer, a title which doesn't exactly lend itself to whimsy. Scully and Mooey were aboard ostensibly as stowaways. Yes, for the first and far from last time, the Sat AM show attempted some kind of narrative framework. They did have the advantage of being co-written by a man who would go on to be one of Britain's most acclaimed television writers, but by all accounts, it didn't make much difference. The Mersey Pirate turned out to be one of those ideas obviously conceived on paper, or possibly a beer mat, before practical considerations were even considered. Hey, why don't we do a whole live broadcast from the original Mersey ferry and dress everyone up as pirates and call the presenter the captain and have open-air games on top deck and it'll be great? And then somehow it got commissioned before anyone considered the actual practical side of things. Inevitably, the show was a hostage to the weather, and quite often an abused and tortured one at that. More often than not, the open-air games were postponed, sometimes to the point of being dropped altogether, requiring the crew, in both senses of the word, to improvise madly until the show resembled a nightmarish, never-ending round on Whose Line Is It Anyway? Worse, the adverse weather conditions inevitably affected the recording equipment itself. It didn't help that the crux of said equipment was a poor Granada techie stuck up the tallest structure they could find, holding a small portable UHF receiver in the general direction of the docks for 2 hours. Should his arm get tired, which it inevitably did, it would throw the whole show into silence or disintegrate the picture into shards of static. On more than one occasion, the whole show had to be called on account of rain. For the same reason, there's almost none of it surviving in the archives. Not because the recordings were junked, but because it was almost impossible to record the damn thing in the first place. It was just far too ambitious a setup for 1979. The final twist of the knife was something they could do nothing about, however. The monumental ITV strike, which killed the entire network for 10 weeks, starting halfway through the Mersey Pirates' run in August. By the time the channel returned, it was October and Tiswas was back. Unsurprisingly, Granada threw up their hands and gave up on the whole idea of the Mersey Pirate, although Scully and Murray would eventually return in their own show on Channel 4 a couple of years later. Granada returned to the drawing board and emerged 1 year later with Fun Factory, a much more sensible studio-bound affair that ran nationwide, except, again, on Time Tees. Your host this time was a fetal, beardless Jeremy Beadle, alongside a robot with the decidedly dodgy name of Kurt Nobler, built by Wilf Lunn. There was still a high concept involved, with everyone half-heartedly pretending this was a real factory, calling the studio Factory Floor, with presenters and guests clocking in, and Beadle outfitted in industrial smock. In format, it was what was becoming the usual routine: silly games, bit of mess, musical spots, here's the Buzzcocks on a lot of acid, and celebrity interviews. It ran over Tiswas' last 2 summers to very little effect, before Granada pulled the plug and withdrew from Sat AM altogether. In contrast, the BBC's summer replacements kept coming out of their Northwest studios for well over a decade. Swap Shop didn't get a deputy until its final couple of series, but it hung around for the next 5 years through various incarnations, as Get Set for Summer, the Get Set Picture Show, and finally the Saturday Picture Show. Common to all of them was professional specky dipstick Mark Curry, future Blue Peter presenter. In fact, the whole lineage only ended in 1986 when Curry was poached by Blue Peter. In all cases, it was a largely unremarkable swap shop in microcosm on a fraction of the budget, which was a problem for most, if not all, of the summer replacements in history. Never mind about them, though. The summer replacements only ran for 4 or 5 months of the year. The remaining 7 or 8 were the crown jewel, and in 1982, both channels found themselves with a vacancy. The BBC had an easiest job replacing it. Swap Shop was popular with the audience and the broadcaster. It was just Noel who got tired of it. So they cast out the net for a new presenter and essentially provided more of the same. They even kept the shop premise, upgraded to a full-blown Saturday Superstore.
The time now is 9:30, and that's opening time.
Saturday morning, get down to the Superstore. You're asking what it's for. You're gonna meet all your friends and find out more. Then 1,000 nights out on the disco floor. You're gonna check out the store, down at the store.
Well, here we are, playing games as usual.
And they're off.
A lovely new car game.
In fact, they arguably overdid the premise in a way beyond even Noel, with different segments of the show referred to as departments, competitions to win plastic carrier bags full of goodies known as bargains, stuff being wheeled around in shopping trolleys and the like. The new host was given the title of General Manager. To cast him, BBC TV apparently simply rang up Radio 1 and asked who had Noel's old job on The Breakfast Show. Mike Reed, great, hire him. Thank God Noel hung around an extra year. We might have got Dave Lee Travis. Still, Reed did okay. He didn't and doesn't have Noel's charisma or rapport with the camera, but he didn't quite have his ego either. He was more than happy to satirise his own image as a frustrated Hank Marvin via a running gag where he'd pull out his guitar and get thwarted at the last moment. And at least this was before he was writing racist calypsos for far-right political parties. Alongside him, the rest of the Swap Shop team were carried over, at least for the first few seasons of the Superstore. Maggie Philbin was a store assistant for season 1, before getting the Tomorrow's World gig. Her other half at the time, Keith Chegwin, kept his location duties, now with the title of Delivery Boy, and John Craven just sort of hung around. But Reed's main sidekick, taking over from Philbin after Series 1, was Blue Peter's very own Sarah Green. in the midst of her transformation from small brunette pixie to blonde sex goddess. It was her enthusiasm and professionalism that uplifted the Superstore beyond its Swap Shop 2.0 roots and helped it grow something resembling a personality of its own. There were other unique elements, of course, like puppet irritant Crow, who despite having the ability to move around and talk, somehow ended up with less personality than charisma and Posh Paws.
Well, I thought I'd have a look at that bunny thing this afternoon, you know.
Oh,
little bunnies.
the Easter Muppet special, Tale of the Bunny Picnic?
Yeah, that's it. What's hey.
The Superstore also built upon Noel's interviews with the stars by combining it with the phone-in element, allowing juvenile viewers to put questions straight to the likes of Morton Harkett live on air. Inevitably, this didn't always go as planned.
You're through to Matt Bianco.
Hello, Matt Bianco. You're a bunch of wankers.
But that sort of thing happened less often than you'd think. And he's not wrong. Probably the most famous one of these didn't involve a chart act or children's BBC star at all, but the actual Prime Minister. One can sense Mike Reed's hand behind that one. So we had the surreal experience of Margaret Thatcher giving a jukebox Jerry-style critique of a Pepsi and Shirley
It
song.
certainly was rhythm. You could do a movement to it. You could do a movement to any rhythm. You could do a movement to a drum without having any song. But there was no melody and no heart.
Followed by the eerie and haunting one of her fielding a question from a young girl about nuclear Armageddon.
In the event of a nuclear war, where will you be?
Oh, my goodness me. I should be in London.
Oh, don't you have your own bunker or something?
Look, dear, let me again point out, the possession of these weapons has kept the peace for 40 years.
Saturday Superstore ran for 5 years before Mike Reed moved on, although not far. He took over the Saturday morning slot on Radio 1. While there's nothing really wrong with it, except perhaps for employing terrifying fascist madman David Icke for a few years, it didn't really transcend its original formula of a slightly bigger swap shop, and is probably, if only by default, the most easily forgotten of the main BBC SatAM shows. But it had the easier task, replacing Swap Shop with more, or as it turned out slightly less, of the same. How could ITV possibly follow up Tiswas? It felt essential to find out. As the company that reluctantly inherited Tiswas and almost immediately saw its demise, they were tasked almost by default with making a replacement most of the country could use. Fortunately, they already had an idea in mind, and it heavily involved a professional wrestler. Big Daddy's Saturday show was heavily promoted in the late summer of 1982, and I mean heavily. Front and centre of the whole affair was the gargantuan looming form of Shirley Crabtree himself. Yes, he was called Shirley, apparently making some kind of concerted attempt at children's stardom. He had his own annuals, he had a strip in Buster Comic, and now he was stepping into Tiswas' old slot, as it were, billed as the children's champion. His assistants were to be Isla Sinclair, of Larry Grayson's Generation Game renown, and noted grapple fan Tommy Boyd, at the start of a career which would see him rise to the top of children's ITV itself, before vanishing into the Partridgian environs of bad-tempered local talk radio. As the hype surrounding Big Daddy's Saturday show built up, it was almost as if Central were actively asking for the whole thing to go wrong. So it did. The week before the first episode, Crabtree suddenly dropped out due to unspecified health problems, probably his heart, leaving the show up a creek and the title a lot more generic.
We're calling on everyone to come and enjoy the
The hastily renamed Saturday show was presented by Sinclair and Boyd alone, with Jeremy Beadle occasionally dropping in to help. But there was a giant 64-inch chested hole in the middle of it, a unique selling point conspicuous by his absence. Without him, it was a little bit like if a set of school teachers had tried to make their own version of Tiswas, and consequently it didn't really catch on. Still, it ran nationwide, even in Anglia and Tyne Tees, with two exceptions: Channel, which almost goes without saying, and oddly enough, TSW, who at the time were new and cocky, and went ahead and made their own Saturday AM show instead. Confusingly enough, it was called The Saturday Show, until Central told them to knock it off, and it was rechristened rather arbitrarily Freeze Frame. It was hosted by Ian Calvert, surrounded by a bunch of kids from one school or another in the vicinity of Plimpton, and really should have been called the Saturday Janner.
How are you? What a gang today. Do you know where they're from?
Who are they?
The Manor Junior School in Ivybridge. A little on the noisy side. What's up?
Notice anything different?
You didn't win that in a cracker.
No, my makeup.
What's wrong with it?
I've got the latest colours for this spring in my makeup. And Melanie's going to be telling us what the colours are and all about how to look after our skins.
That's the colours for spring?
Yep.
Roll on winter. Looks very nice
You're
indeed.
wicked, you are. Really wicked.
Never broadcast outside of TSW, but ran until 1985, just as the Central Saturday Show did. If you ask me, us southwestern kids probably came out of it on an even keel. Not Big Daddy's Saturday Show did improve as it went along, particularly in its second season, by which time it gained a vague sense of personality to replace the one Crabtree was meant to have provided. But at all times, most people were watching the Superstore on the other side, except for a few dozen kids in Oakhampton who were watching Freeze Frame because their cousin's class was on it. Sinclair bailed out after 2 series, and the third and final was retooled as the Saturday Starship, with a vague science fiction premise that amounted to lots of flashing lights and silly costumes, and Boyd now joined by Bonnie Langford. Didn't really help, and the show died in 1985 to no uproar and little mourning. It had long since been overshadowed by its own summer replacement. It came from the other new ITV company, TBS, in the south. The last Saturday AM show to come out of this region had been the Saturday Banana, and its main legacy had been Metal Friggin' Mickey. But that had been made by Southern Television, and they were dead now. Now the region belonged to TVS. Like TSW, a young, cocky and ambitious company, but unlike TSW, blessed with the funds and talent to actually fulfil those ambitions. Their contribution to Sat AM started in 1982, initially as temporary replacement for the moribund Tiswas in TBS's first 2 months.
Hey you! Hey you! Get ready, get on your feet, get into gear and hit the street. Hey you! Get moving, it's not too far, you're looking good, so come as you are. Hey you! You never know what you see when you're through that door with the 7-3. Never seen nothing, no, not like this place, never been, no, no way, not ever, no, never seen no place, no way similar, not like 73. Hey you, get ready, get on your feet, get into gear and hit the street. It's you that we want to see, so get down to 73. Get down to 73, hey you, get down to 73.
It was remarkable on a number of levels. Not least of these was the fact that not only did it take the narrative high-concept premise further than almost any Saturday AM show before or since, but it actually succeeded with it for the first and pretty much only time. Number 73 was set in a terraced house, presumably in Gillingham, if only because the first 2 seasons were filmed there. The landlady was Ethel Davis, played by Sandy Toksvig, with Nick Staverson as her nephew Harry, and inexplicably the composer Patrick Doyle as nutrag inventor and unlikely love interest Percy. Together with semi-permanent lodger Dawn, played by latter-day Cannes Jury Prize-winning filmmaker Andrea Arnold on Wheels, they welcomed various relatively minor celebrities, it was just a regional programme after all, for chats, interviews, semi-ad-lib nonsense based around the characters and premise, and at the end of every episode a general knowledge quiz involving sandwiches in some under-explained capacity. It did quite well, although it obviously helped that it was replacing the Sally James Gordon Astley last series of Tiswas and not the real thing. They brought it back a couple of months later as a summer replacement between Tiswas and what they still thought was going to be Big Daddy's Saturday show. This more extended run was even more successful, and summer 1983's third series was broadcast to the whole nation for the first time, partly because it was so good and partly because no one had anything better. Naturally, the budget and production values went up to match, including a move from the pokey old TBS theatre in Gillingham to the full-blown Maidstone studios. Patrick Doyle quickly remembered he was a classically trained composer and quit for the world of soundtracks, to be replaced by singer Kim Goody and future CITV art Christ Neil Buchanan, starting a long association with the south of England, despite being Scouse. Even the quality of guest stars went up a little. What number 73 lacked in glitz and cash, it made up for in coolness factor. This was the only Saturday morning show that could tempt on the likes of Iggy Pop, even if he quickly demonstrated why that was an extraordinarily bad idea in the first place. And even the narrative premise continued to work. Partly that was due to the basic framework being deceptively simple. It's a house and people come to the house and that's it. And in large part this was due to Sandy Toksvig. Both her undeniable skill at holding together a situation almost exclusively told by her ad-libs, and the tone her presence imposed upon the programme. Deadpan, dry, even subtle humour was the order of the day. Even the increasingly unbalanced, climactic, daring, dazzling, death-defyingly dull, devastatingly dangerous, delectable, delicatessenable, divinely decadent sandwich quiz was underplayed compared to how Tiswas or even the Saturday show would have handled it. Didn't make any more sense, mind. Meanwhile, the house was the setting for all sorts of surreal goings-on and occasional full-blown storylines, such as the one where Ethel almost gets married to a bank manager in a cliffhanger ending to Series 5. This was all infinitely preferable to whatever Get Set for Summer was calling itself this year over on the other side. Nothing lasts forever, of course. Sandy Toksvig moved on in 1986, abruptly written out between series. She's buggered off to Australia anyway, on with the show. Unfortunately, she turned out to be a load-bearing tiny lesbian Viking, and as they might have expected, the programme started to disintegrate without her. TVS panicked and started ladling in new characters by the truckload. Storylines became a lot more stretched and corny. The awesome title music was remixed for the worse.
Get on your feet, get into gear and hit the street. Get moving, it's not too far. You're looking good, come as you are. You never know what you see when you're through that door with the 772. Hey, get ready, get on your feet, get into gear and hit the street. It's you that we want to see, so get down to 73. Get down to 73. Get down to 73.
Worse still, in the real world, the rest of TVS was starting to resent the presence of the set, by necessity a permanent fixture, taking up precious space in the Maidstone studios. So they decided to move the show for the second and final time to an outdoor set. But not just an outdoor remake of the same basic setting, oh no. That would be the obvious thing to do. That could potentially have resulted in success. So a storyline was cooked up for what became the last season, involving J.C. Birch, the evil new landlord, tearing the whole street down and building a Wild West theme park. Because that makes any sense at all, right? And so from January 1988, halfway through Series 8, the show became 7T3, with the saloon doors and everything. And the premise officially became unsustainably crap. The big old theme park set also turned out to be far too expensive to maintain, especially for a TBS trying to make inroads into international television. By now the whole thing had become such a giant mess that no one was watching anymore anyhow. So the show was quietly killed off in March 1988. The slot was still TVS's to play with, however, and they started working on a replacement for the winter. And now the pressure was really on, because by now the BBC was providing the stiffest opposition they'd ever had.
Hey you! Hey you! Get ready, get on your feet, get into gear and hit the street. Hey you! Get moving, it's not too far, you're looking good, scrum as you are. Hey you! You never know what you see when you through that door with the 7-3. Never seen nothing, no, not like this place. Never been, no way, not ever, no. Never seen no place, no way similar, not like 73. Hey you, get ready, get on your feet, get into gear and hit the street. It's you that we want to see, so get down to 73. Get down to 73, hey you, get down to 73.